This video is going to give you some tips and tricks on shading when you're working on a portrait drawing. So in this case, we're working on a gridded portrait. So you can see here I have a photo of my daughter that I've taken with a grid over it, and I have a white piece of paper where I've drawn an identical grid. Those grid boxes are just slightly larger, and I've drawn my lines. Now, materials for this, I'm going to be using a 2H pencil like I showed there, and I'm also going to be using an ebony pencil. I'm going to do the majority of the shading with the ebony pencil. The 2H pencil is more for lines. You can see there I'm working with a kneaded eraser. That is going to be something that's going to help me with shading. And some additional tools I like to have a value scale. So you can see there's a value scale that I have created. I'm labeling those values 0 through 7, and that is going to help me later on with shading. The last tool I like to have, I'll call windows. So I just took some scrap pieces of paper and I cut some windows out of them. One of them perfectly fits the box of my printed image, and the other perfectly fits the box of my white piece of paper. Now, using those windows will really help me to eliminate distractions and focus on shading one box at a time. So as I begin to shade, I would typically advise you, if you are a right-handed person like I am, to start on the left and work your way over to the right, or start from the top and work your way down so that you're not dragging your hand through your shading and ruining what you've done. In our case, I'm just selecting a box that I think will be a good one to demonstrate on, so I've selected a box kind of in the middle. I'll have to be careful as I'm shading that I don't let my hand run through that box. So my first step here is going over my lines and darkening them. If you look at the lines in my printed image, you can see that they do show up fairly dark. As I'm doing this, I am simply observing. I'm drawing what I see. So this is what I see, so I'm trying to recreate it. I'm doing the shading with my ebony pencil, and I'm going through and just darkening the areas that need to be the darkest first. I like to shade, when I shade, I like to work dark to light, but that is personal preference. As I continue to shade, you can see me working dark from light. I'm shading one box at a time, and I'm really just observing and drawing what I see. So I'm starting with the darkest areas here. I'm shading in a circular motion. I like to move my pencil in small little circles. I press very light, and I'm shading my darkest values that I see first. Now, what I will caution you to do is when you're shading, shade box by box or grid by grid, just like you did when you were drawing your contour lines, and really challenge yourself to observe all the small shifts in value. It might be tempting to look at a square and say, oh, that looks dark, I'm gonna shade it all one value, but really if you carefully observe, as I'm doing here in her shirt or her vest, you can see that there are several different values, and if I include those, even if it seems tedious, if I include those, that is going to be what makes it look hyper realistic. So the other thing to notice as you're watching me finish shading this box is how I'm able to achieve these different values. Now, I'm doing all my shading just with my ebony pencil. Occasionally there you see me pick up the 2H pencil if I have some tiny details. The ebony pencil is really rounded, so it's hard to get in small spaces. That's where having different drawing pencils will be to your advantage. And again, I'm just using the two that I have in front of me. Now, I'm able to achieve these different values simply by pressing hard or pressing soft. You can see me go through and blend with my finger. I tend to color blend, or I should say shade rather than color, to achieve the desired effect. You could also use a blending stump if you need to get into some tiny spaces, but I'm doing most of what I see with my finger. So again, my two biggest tips: really focus on observing those tiny little changes in value, making sure that you include those, and just play around with how hard or soft you are pressing with your pencil. Another tip I have, if you're shading like I did, if you shaded a box towards the bottom, you're worried about your hand dragging it in, use your windows or just a scrap piece of paper that you can find to put underneath your hand as you're shading so that you're not spreading the colors around. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and I'm going to shade an area in her skin. So the box that I shaded before, you were really able to see a lot of different drastic values. If I look in her head, she doesn't have a lot of wrinkles. She has brand new soft baby skin. So there isn't a crazy amount of value changes here. But if I focus on that one box, just by observing it, I can notice there are several different values. And this is where my value scale comes into play. I like to use my value scale to compare back and forth. So I've got my values labeled 0 through 7, and I'm holding that value scale up to my image and comparing. So I noticed on the top left of the box, that value is at about a 2 on my value scale. So when I shade, I need to make sure that I make it dark enough. Now, if you're a little afraid to shade with your pencil directly on your paper, especially for those light values, here's another tip. You can take a scrap piece of paper and your finger. So rub your finger on that ebony pencil or that graphite, and then actually do some drawing with your finger. It might be hard to show in this video, but it is really subtly adding value. So in those areas that are really light, sometimes if you use your pencil first, it will create some pencil lines that you just can't get to go away. I just took a second there and realized that I had forgotten to erase my grid lines beforehand. So in areas like the shirt where I have really dark values, I don't have to worry about that so much. But in her skin, most of my values are fairly light. So I need to make sure that I go through and erase my grid lines. I can actually use a pink eraser to do that, or any kind of eraser that you have. My kneaded eraser is not the best for erasing those grid lines, so I brought in a different material. At this point, you can see me doing plenty of shading using my finger, and on the darker values, I'm going to go ahead and color with the ebony pencil directly on the paper, especially towards the bottom of her box. That's the top of her eyebrow, so there is more of a shadow there. I believe if I was comparing it to my value scale, it was about a 4 or a 5 on my value scale. So I'm just going to go ahead and color directly on there. Now, if you are shading through a window, as I am, you want to be really careful that you don't end up with square edges around the grid that you are focusing on. So really, I would recommend as you're shading, take that window off of your white piece of paper, just like I am there. Leave the window over your printed photograph, but maybe take it off on the one that you are shading. So here you can see the finished box. If I look at it all by itself, it sure looks weird. She kind of looks like she's about to be like a cranky little elf. But it looks kind of strange, but I promise that once I get the entire thing shaded, it's going to look how I want it to look. All right, it's not gonna, right now that box really stands out, but once I get all of the skin around her shaded, it's going to work perfectly. So I'm just going back using my value scale to check. So I'm checking on the upper left. It looks like that was a 2. Do I have it matching a 2? And I'm noticing that I think I've actually shaded it a little too dark in that spot. So that's where the kneaded eraser comes into play. You can see me using the kneaded eraser to dab. You don't rub with a kneaded eraser, you just dab and pick up little bits of pigment at a time. So the kneaded eraser is perfect for taking away chunks of value if you get a little too dark in certain areas. Now, sometimes the kneaded eraser does use marks, so you may have to use your finger to kind of blend or smooth that over. Again, I'm using my value scale a second and third time, just comparing back and forth to make sure that all my values are where I want them to be before I move on to the next box. So even in a box as simple as this, it would be easy to say like, oh, that's just a medium gray, and shade the whole thing the same value. But if you really slow down and force yourself to observe like I'm doing here, you're gonna notice the subtle or small changes in value. And again, including those is going to be what makes your drawing realistic. So after many hours of work, this is my finished product. It is nowhere near perfect, but it's good enough for me. Remember my tips of observing the subtle changes in highlights and shadows, shading box by box, and doing your best to recreate what you see, not what you think you see.